Differentiating instruction to meet the needs of gifted learners and students with disabilities in general education classrooms. This presentation will provide an overview of differentiated instruction. It will begin with a definition of differentiated instruction, the framework used when differentiated instruction, and then specific examples for how to differentiate content, process, and product. Differentiated instruction is an approach to teaching a diverse group of students that meets the unique needs of each learner within the group. The rationale for differentiating instruction is that all students benefit from a variety of instructional methods and supports. It's important to note here that the framework for universal design for learning is very much in comparison to the framework for differentiated instruction. So the UDL, or Universal Design for Learning principles, and the approaches used within the UDL framework can also be used to help teachers differentiate their instruction. Ultimately, the purpose of differentiated instruction is to teach students in ways that allows them to learn and to provide opportunities for them to demonstrate what they've learned in a variety of ways so that they can continue to progress. Carol Ann Tomlinson provided the framework for differentiated instruction in 1999. She discussed how teachers can differentiate content, or what they teach, process, or how they teach and how students learn, and products, or assessments. The purpose of differentiating content, process, or products would be to address readiness levels, or the ability levels where students are at certain points in different areas, or to address student interests, and or to address the student learning profiles, or how they learn best. Another component that can be added to what we address when we're differentiating instruction is we can also consider the cultural backgrounds of students with disabilities and gifted learners to best differentiate our instruction. So to summarize, teachers can differentiate content, process, product, or what they teach, and how students learn, and how students demonstrate what they learned, to address readiness levels, interests, learning profiles, and their cultural backgrounds. Let's give some examples for ways that you could differentiate content to address readiness levels, interests, and learning profiles. One way to differentiate content would be to identify the big ideas. That will be discussed on the next slide. Also, we will discuss how to embed instruction related to IEP goals and how to use curriculum mapping, note-taking, organizers, and tiered lessons on the slides that follow. It's also important to differentiate content by embedding the student's special interests when learning new content. It's important to allow students to make choices when learning new content and allow students to select topics of study. In order to differentiate content by thinking about learning profile, you can select content that students can learn visually if they have difficulties with understanding oral presentations. You can also integrate content across curriculum areas and the fine arts to access the student's strengths. It's also important to alter the pacing of the delivery of the content, and for some students that means you pace the lessons quicker than what would be typical, or you slow down the pacing of the lessons depending on the students' learning profiles. Keep in mind that these are all examples and are not an exhaustive list of ways that you could differentiate content, but it does provide you a starting place of things to think about when you are thinking about how and why you should differentiate content. One thing you could do when differentiating content for diverse classrooms is to first identify the big ideas. The big ideas are the things that you want all students to learn from the lesson or unit of instruction. For example, if you're teaching a geometry lesson related to area and perimeter in a third grade class, your big ideas might be that all students will measure the length of the sides of a rectangle and square. They will add up the sides of a rectangle and square, and they will indicate that adding up the sides of a rectangle and square is called finding the perimeter. in this same example, some students might also identify the area of a rectangle and measure items in the classroom, determine the area and perimeter of the items. So these additional items are not the big ideas. These are things that students who are higher achievers or who have mastered the big ideas, these are things that they might learn in addition. And then on top of that, for your highest achieving students or for students who require more authentic learning experiences, you might have different objectives. And for a few students, they might learn how to create a floor plan of their bedrooms and figure out the area and perimeter of their room. They also might figure out how much carpet they would need to cover the floor in their room and determine how much it will cost based on a flyer with prices. So you can see that first the big ideas are identified, then additional learning targets can be set based on the different abilities of the students in your classroom. One thing I'd like to point out, however, is that this doesn't mean that the gifted learners or the highest achieving learners are the only students who are doing authentic learning activities. It's important to provide students who are low achieving or below grade level with just as much authentic problem-based learning opportunities as students who are gifted. Another thing to consider when differentiating content is that you can find ways to embed instruction related to a student's IEP goals into instructional lessons and activities, and that would be differentiating your content. For example, you might be teaching a class about the phases of matter, and you have a student with autism spectrum disorder in the class who's working on communication or social interaction skills. And so during those lessons on matter, the student might be learning how to hand out materials to students, might learn how to ask for materials from a peer, share materials with others, learn how to ask for help from a peer or a teacher, learn how to respond to comments and questions from a peer or a teacher, or any of these things that might be on the student's IEP. The reality is that these content-rich lessons provide many opportunities for students with disabilities to work on their IEP goals in meaningful ways. Another way to differentiate content is through curriculum compacting. And we often think about doing this for students who are gifted or students who are high achievers. And what this means is you streamline the curriculum to allow students to move at a quicker pace, and then they have time to pursue an alternate topic or go into greater depth in an area of study. This prevents students from having to engage in lessons with material and instructional objectives that they have already mastered. So this would prevent students from getting bored by engaging in lessons that they already know the material for. I want to point out, though, it's not just for gifted learners that we might use curriculum compacting. There are many students with disabilities that might know a whole lot about one area, and they don't need to have the pacing slowed down for that area. For example, there might be a student with an autism spectrum disorder who already knows all of her addition facts, but the majority of the class doesn't. If this is the case, you can provide a quick probe so the student can demonstrate her mastery and then work with the student on learning how to add two-digit numbers while the other students are working on basic facts. So with curriculum compacting, it allows you to assess the learning of students with disabilities, assess the learning of students who don't have disabilities, assess the learning of students who are gifted, and based on what their pre-assessment information shows, you may need to use curriculum compacting to differentiate your content and prevent them from having to engage in material in which they already know. Another way to differentiate content is to provide tiered lessons. Tiered lessons mean that you provide different activities for students to learn the designated content based on the readiness levels of your students. For example, if you're teaching a concept such as discrimination, you might have 3 tiers in which students can choose or be assigned different activities. One tier might involve students engaging in an activity or a lesson in which they learn about the similarities and differences of different groups of people. A second tier might include students engaging in an activity in which they learn the meaning of discrimination and how it affects individuals. And a third tier might involve students writing a persuasive paper related to discrimination. So these are just examples, but you can see here that you can address a major concept but teach it in different ways and provide different activities that allow students to meaningfully engage at the level that they're performing. At the beginning of the school year, teachers often do an interest inventory to find out what their students' special interests are. However, very few students actually use this information when planning academic lessons. One way to differentiate content is to constantly be thinking about ways that you can embed your students' special interests into the learning activities. For example, you might have a student who's passionate about trains. You can use an analogy of the cars on a train to explain the concept that all stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. So this is just one example where you could take an interest and connect it to something that you were going to teach anyway. There are a variety of different ways and very varied interests that you can continually be thinking about as you're planning lessons across different content areas. Whenever appropriate, it's important to allow students to select topics of study to demonstrate mastery of the content, as opposed to always assigning specific topics to students. For example, if your goal is related to learning research skills, the students can select any topic of research in which they have a strong interest as long as they're able to demonstrate the specific research skills that you're targeting. Another example is if your goal is related to learning how to collect data and graph data and analyze data, the students can select the topic for data collection based on his or her individual interests. Another way to differentiate content is to provide note-taking organizers or guided notes for students who struggle with accessing the content without this level of support. It allows them to follow along with the instruction and fill in important information throughout the lesson and provides them with key signals for what's important throughout an activity or a lecture or an assignment. It also helps to keep the students actively engaged in the learning process as opposed to just sitting and getting information. So in addition to addressing content and differentiating content, it's also important to differentiate process, which means how teachers teach and how students learn. So here are some examples of ways that you could differentiate process based on readiness level, interest, and learning profiles. One way is to provide reading materials that are on different levels to provide access to the content for students who are reading either below grade level or above grade level. You might need to enlarge text or read information aloud to students who are unable to read on grade level. You can use scaffolding to provide access to the general education content. So you might tap into what the student already knows and help them build bridges to learn the new content. You can also use a variety of materials at different cognitive levels. So in addition to different reading materials at different levels, you can use music, you can use magazines, you can use videos, websites, audio tapes, a variety of different ways to provide access to the content that's being learned. For some students, you might need to eliminate abstract information or at least explain the abstract material whenever necessary if they have difficulty learning at the abstract level and need more concrete and real life examples. You can also differentiate process by allowing students to use learning materials that they enjoy. So if they learn enjoying using an iPad or a computer or learn through drawing or watching videos, then you're tapping into what they enjoy. You can group students together based on similar interests for a topic of study or for an activity. A lot of teachers group students based on their ability levels, and that is not the purpose of differentiated instruction. Although there are some instances where you might group students based on ability, primarily you want to have heterogeneous groupings or groupings based on various information, not just ability levels or readiness levels. Taking students who have a common interest and having them work together could be a very positive experience for all learners, no matter what their ability levels are. Another way to differentiate process is to set up learning centers based on student interests around the room. And if you find that a student does better attending to instruction while fidgeting with an object or holding a special item or coloring or standing, allow students to do these things during the instruction if it helps them to engage. You'll know if it is a distraction or a help if when you assess the student learning. If the student does these things and is able to demonstrate